This is the Expert and the Idiot podcast. If you like the show and you'd like to support us, there's a link to our Patreon in the description below. Some benefits include getting access to new episodes up to a month in advance. There's also links to USARK and USARK Florida. If you're not already a member, please sign up. Enjoy the show. Welcome to episode 52, right? Yeah, 52 of The Expert and the Idiot. Today I'm talking to Bill Stegall of Phoenix Reptiles. And what is that? Is that after Phoenix, Arizona, or after Phoenix, like the mythical creature?
Yeah, Adam, hey, it's great to be on. It seems like we've been trying to get this on the books for quite some time. So
yeah.
I'm excited to finally get this thing going. I've been looking forward to meeting you and talking to you and doing this episode for a while. So thanks for having me on.
Oh, yeah. I appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much.
The Phoenix is the mythical bird. And
okay.
I named my business Phoenix Reptiles because shortly before I became a small business, my father had passed away. And the name of his business, his company, was Phoenix Enterprise. So I took the name in memory of him and his business.
Oh, cool. That's awesome. So that's got some real meaning behind it, some sentimental value.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what year did you get started with keeping? I mean, I know, we were just talking before we started recording here, and you've got grandkids, right? So, I mean, what year did you get started, and what drew you into the hobby, and then how has your experience evolved over the years?
Well, I was relatively late to the party. I didn't acquire my first reptile until I think about 1999, which would have put me in my mid 30s. So
okay.
Again, compared to most people, that have been doing this, my exposure was pretty late in life. It wasn't that I didn't love reptiles. As a kid, I loved reptiles. I loved, in particular, dinosaurs and snakes. The problem is I didn't have very supporting parents of keeping reptiles in the house, and that on the fact that we moved every 2 or 3 years as a child would have made it difficult for me to keep reptiles anyway. So to answer your question, I always had a passion for them. I think at one time I had the largest collection of Chinese produced rubber snakes in the world.
Wow.
So I had to get my passion with reptiles from toys. But it never went away. And then I went to school and had a family. And then when my son was in 4th or 5th grade, he had a ball python in his classroom.
Oh boy.
And he said he wanted a snake for his birthday or Christmas or something. And I was like, absolutely. All we got to do is convince your mom and we'll be good to go. And that's how it started. And then it didn't take much long after that. I was hooked. I found a local mentor who, taught me the basics of keeping, and I was breeding pretty quick after that. And the passion just never turned off. My son is long out of it. Once he graduated college, moved out of the house, he doesn't own a single reptile. But
really,
that's just the way things are. A lot of people, especially at that age, their passions, move on. And so, mine just never did. I've always enjoyed them, been fascinated by them. And now I'm lucky enough to, be doing it for a living.
So that first ball python, I'm assuming, did it start with just one and then it became a pair, and then how did it build out from there?
Yeah, I just started with one, a normal male. And, at the time, I think there were about 5 or 6 ball python morphs, known on the planet, like yellow belly. And I think they had just discovered spider, it's pastel and Mojave, and I think lesser. And I think that was, about it, albino. So it was within the first few months that I knew I wanted to like breed, step it up, get more, get a rack, start breeding. Because my mentor, I don't know if you know Tony Hurt.
Oh yeah. Yeah, he's going to be on here in a couple episodes.
Fantastic. It's a small world. Tony was my mentor. He taught me about ball pythons, and then he got me into carpet pythons, which I kept for a long time. And then he got out, and he was out for a long time. And then he got back in, and then I kind of became his mentor because I had, you know, gone through a bunch of carpet python stuff, and he needed some help getting back in the game. And so it was just been very ironic. Tony and I keep in touch a lot. We're very good friends. And so I look forward to your episode with him. But so, yes, he was breeding ball pythons at the time. And so, it was just natural progression for me to learn from him and start doing it on my own. And we had some joint projects, and it just kind of went from there. You know how it is. These things, when you get ball python fever, it just explodes, and it exploded in me for sure.
Luckily, I haven't caught that yet.
Reptile fever.
Yeah. Yes, that I do have. I actually, we have a pair of ball pythons, and I told my son, I said, yeah, but I'm kind of thinking about maybe just moving the ball pythons along. And he was like, really? And I said, yeah. And he didn't really say anything, and he walked away. And then my younger son comes in the room, and he goes, Adam's in his room hiding under his bed crying.
Oh, no.
So I had to go and tell him. I was like, dude, just talk to me, if you're really connected to them, we'll move them into your room, and they can be something that you look after.
Yeah. He's old enough now where you should be able to do everything.
Yeah, exactly. And that definitely builds character, having that responsibility, and I think it's a good thing. So that first normal ball python, you don't happen to still have that snake, do you?
It went to a family member. And gosh, you're talking a long time ago now.
Yeah.
So it's passed. But it went to a family member who kept it for a long, long time. And then I think it died in their care.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, you never know. So, you hear these stories about ball pythons that are 30, 40 years old, and
yeah,
it's wild, or even maybe sometimes older if they were wild caught, and, they don't actually know the age of the animal.
Yeah.
So what after the ball pythons, what kind of carpet pythons did you get kind of sucked into? What was Tony into at the time?
I've always kind of been a Frankenstein, like even now and today, the stuff that I like to produce, with the green trees is kind of Frankenstein stuff. And it was the same with carpets. At the time, the Jaguar morph had really just become available in the United States. And Tony found a very young male Jaguar carpet python and coastal. And we acquired that animal together as kind of a joint project and started breeding it to jungle carpets that we acquired from Sean Christian, and started producing, jungle jags, which were kind of a big hit back in the day because they were cleaner than the coastal jags. And then, we kind of went from there. And that was about the time Tony had gotten out. But I continued to breed carpet pythons for over a decade, and produced quite a few. And most of them were, the morphs, the, zebras and super zebras and jags. And I worked with the ocelot trait in my collection. Lucky enough to have one female that threw ocelot jags. And so, did that for a long time.
Yeah. What else have you kind of transitioned to and branched out into? I mean, so going from the ball pythons to the carpets are, so different than ball pythons. And, I'm assuming like you probably couldn't keep those in racks, right? Like they don't seem to go so well in a rack.
Yeah, I did keep them some in racks, some in cages. I had very large ARS racks that I now keep my Borneo shorttails in. But I kept some in there. But yeah, I went to traditional, 4-foot cages, 3-foot, 4-foot cages. Um, and about that time, I kind of started having this thinking in the back of my mind that, well, maybe one day I'll want to turn this into a business. So I started kind of thinking about turning it into a business, and my business plan was to be able to offer a variety of different animals. In other words, when I went to a show, I didn't want to just set up ball pythons or carpet pythons. So I thought about some other species that I might enjoy keeping, and also being able to, represent as Phoenix Reptiles. So I acquired some Borneo short-tailed pythons and raised those up and began to produce those. I acquired some rhino rat snakes, which I thought were really cool, but they were one of the species that I had, and I kept them for a couple of years, but they just didn't do it for me. For whatever reason, they just were something that, didn't work. And which, I think that's a pretty natural thing to happen. You don't know if you're going to like something until you experiment with it and try it. So I had some rhino rat snakes for a while. I eventually got rid of those. I acquired some rough scale pythons from D pretty early on, and experimented with those and bred those and produced those a couple of times. So that was my plan, and I was looking forward. I was looking like 10 years into the future, because I knew I wanted to retire from my profession pretty early, and I thought if I was going to become a professional, reptile person, that I should have some diversity. So that was kind of my plan. That changed a lot, really, over the last 4 or 5 years for lots of different reasons. But those are the species that I have kept and worked with primarily.
With the short tails, do you play Frankenstein with those, or do you keep those pure?
I keep those pure. Yeah. I'm a Frankenstein, but I'm not a terrible bad Frankenstein.
You're not a monster.
I'm not a monster. I would be ostracized from that community. I mean, I somewhat know my steps and bounds, but no, I do work with the Borneos, and so the Borneos are a little bit, because their genetics are polygenic, and they're not, typical Mendelian. So you get to play a little bit of Frankenstein when you start messing with the polygenic traits. But I've kept those.
Can you explain polygenic traits to me?
Yeah, so polygenic, it's just like green tree pythons. Green tree pattern and color is polygenic. Polygenic just means that, let's say, for example, in jungle carpets, you want to produce striped animals. Well, you start with parents that have some degree of striping, and then you just continue to breed for that trait that you're looking for, whether it's a color or a pattern. And if you just continue to breed striped parents to striped parents, you'll produce striped offspring. Is kind of the easiest way, the simplest way to describe polygenics. It's not just one gene loci that causes the trait; it's multiple.
Okay, so more line breeding.
Yeah, like line breeding, kind of like height in people, right? Like if you have two people that are really tall, you're more likely to get a tall, child than two people that are really short. It's just anything can happen, but that's polygenic traits.
Yeah, I literally just picked up my first short tail, a blood python martyr line, on Thursday. So I'm excited. I'm excited. They're so different than everything else, so I'm excited to see how they're going to fit into the collection.
Yeah. They're very different. And that was one of the reasons that I acquired them, because they were so different than ball pythons and carpet pythons. And like I said at the time, I wanted to be able to provide a lot of variability in what I had available to people, but I still wanted them to be relatively easy to care for, which Borneo short-tailed pythons are.
Yeah. So when did the green tree or the green python chondros, when did that obsession start? That seems to be your primary focus now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was right around 2010, 2011. I acquired my first green tree python. I had been wanting one for a decade before that, but I didn't acquire them because I didn't believe they were easy to keep. All the ones that I had been exposed to and had talked to people about were defensive and difficult to take care of, and needed frequent vet care and stuff like that, which I didn't want to provide. So I avoided them for a long time. But then some of the people that crossed over between carpets and green tree pythons convinced me, hey, listen, get a captive bred animal, from a good source. And, there's a very, very good chance it's going to be problem free. And you're going to find out it's going to be the easiest snake that you keep in your collection. And so I did. And it was. And
what makes them easier than a ball python?
Well, you never have to pick up the green tree python when you clean its cage. Like when I'm doing my terrestrial, whether it's the Bordeaux or the ball python, and it always tends to want to lay on its shit, you got to pick it up. And, with the green tree python, man, it's just in its cage. And I use puppy pads or paper towels as my substrate. And you just pull the paper towel out and put a fresh paper towel in, and you're done. I mean, it's just,
okay.
It doesn't get any easier than that.
Because I kind of have the same thought in my mind, right? That they're expert level, that I'm not there yet. That my keeping isn't that I'm not a good enough keeper to keep them. That I need something more hardy. That if I get one, I'm just going to kill it, right? Like that's kind of so. Walk me through that. I mean, what is, if they are easy to care for? I've heard that. What about hydration? Do you mist your animals? Do you keep an ambient humidity in the room? How often are you changing their water out? Because is that that's probably one of their primary, one of the biggest things that you have to really make sure is on point for them, right? Is hydration?
Yeah. Hydration and humidity. I was just going to address, your initial fear about getting an animal and you're not being able to, keep a green tree python and that you'd kill it and all that. Those concerns, I think, are warranted if you're talking about an imported animal. A lot of those can be hit or miss, whether it's going to acclimate and survive, especially in somebody that would be keeping it for the first time. But the stuff that I deal with is all captive bred. And so I think you have to make a big distinction between those two, because it's like talking about two different animals, really. So if I would just say from here on out, just assume we're talking about, the husbandry and care and breeding of captive bred green tree pythons, because
Okay.
I'm certainly not an expert in wild caught stuff, because I've only ever encountered a few in my collection. So if you're just talking about captive bred animals, hydration and humidity are definitely important, but they're separate. And so if you want to address hydration, a large water bowl with frequent water changes is the key, a clean water source. So I change my water, give them fresh water, just tap water, twice a week, unless they foul the water, of course, then they're getting fresh water that day. So fresh water in a relatively large water container, twice a day. That's pretty easy to do. Twice a week. That's pretty easy to do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, are you using a disposable bowl, or are you using reusable bowls that you sanitize?
I use both. Yeah.
Okay.
Some of them, I use the 16-ounce deli cups,
Sure.
just like you would in a ball python rack. But I prefer something that's a little bit larger than that. So I actually buy from, one of these restaurant stores. There's some pretty good size water dishes that are meant to be disposable, but I reuse them until they crack or break or get really fouled, and then I'll trash them.
Okay. And so when you're changing the water twice a week, when are you doing sanitize once a week? And then do you just go around, dump and pour new water in? Or are you doing are you actually cleaning the bowl twice a week?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. What you said, your first thought. So like every Monday they get a freshwater dish, freshwater bowl. And then on Thursday, I'll go by and just dump the water, fresh water.
Okay.
same bowl.
And this is just tap water. It's not filtered or RO or anything like that.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Um, so that's now. What about misting? Are you doing ambient humidity, or are you actually misting their enclosures?
Yeah, hydration's a little bit more not complicated, but warrants a little bit more discussion um, than hydration. Humidity levels, I think they need to be higher, than most people's ambient humidity, especially where I live in the winters. It gets really dry, heaters kicking on in the facility and stuff. So my ambient humidity is often in the 20s and 30s. And
Mm,
that is not appropriate for a green tree python in the long run. They can tolerate parts of the day that have low humidity like that. But eventually, somewhere along the line, in most cases, you're going to need to supply supplemental humidity to the animal or to the cage or to the building. And it's just one of those things that can be done lots of different ways. There's some people that literally never spray their green tree python, and there's some people that spray theirs every day. And you just
mm.
have to know your environment. You have to learn to know the animal. You have to learn to know the cage that it's in. And basically, what you're looking for is the least amount of humidity supplementation that will provide good sheds.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
And what does that look like?
Like a complete shed. You just, when your animal sheds, you want it to have a nice, good, complete shed. And if that's
Okay.
misting the cage every day, then you miss it every day. If it means misting the cage twice a week, then you missed twice a week. If it means never missed, you never missed.
Mm.
So lots of different ways
So
to provide that supplemental humidity. I don't measure humidity. It's not like, oh, you have to have 80% humidity, 70%. I don't even measure it. I just provide
okay.
it. And as long as you're
Okay.
having a cage that is not wet all the time, in other words, there's a dry out period and then there's a moisture enriched period, then you're going to be fine. There's a lot of leadway in humidity.
So the puppy pads and the paper towels. So you're actually misting those, and you'll get those will get damp, I'm assuming, and then they completely dry out, and then you'll mist again.
Absolutely. And what I'll do is directly wet the puppy pad or the paper towel. Just take a lot of times I'll just take the old water dish if it's still clean and I'll just dump it out on the puppy pad,
Mm.
provide the fresh water. But in addition to that, I'm also spraying the cage and the animal directly. That's what it takes in my room and my environment and my caging to get that adequate shed. It requires wetting both the substrate and then occasionally, maybe twice a week, spraying down the animal in the enclosure. If they're in their shed cycle, I'm spraying them every day.
Okay. And do you ever run into any issues as far as RIs or anything like that? Any kind of bacterial infections from like trying to find that perfect balance of providing the humidity they need, but also minimizing, the bacteria in the enclosure?
Again, I kind of knock on wood here, but since we've discovered a test for Nidovirus, which we can talk a little bit about, I'm sure you've heard Nidovirus and
Yeah.
other species,
Serpento.
Serpentovirus. Once we discovered that and could test for that and isolate those animals, I have never had a respiratory infection in a green tree python that wasn't Nido positive.
Interesting. Okay. So you're thinking that, or in your experience, I should say, the animals that you've kept that have had RI, they're getting it because they have another issue, and the RI is just a manifestation of that, like Serpento or Nido.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I think you can provide conditions that are so unacceptable to a green tree python that it will get a respiratory infection. But I think if you're even anywhere close in the conditions that you're providing, and I'm talking about heat and humidity, that it's just not going to happen, to a captive bred animal that's not Nido positive.
Okay. What have your experiences been with Nido since it kind of first made its appearance?
Yeah, I was kind of right in that sweet spot of people when Nido Nidovirus was discovered, I had been keeping green trees for probably at least 5 years. These were one of these things that was kind of like our thinking. Well, if you're going to get into green trees, just be prepared. They're going to get respiratory infection. They're going to just mysteriously die on you. They're just a real, brittle species to keep. And I think a lot of that was Nidovirus, and it was just going unknown, undetected. We didn't have a test for it. So once that was kind of discovered, and the testing became super easy for it, and you could separate those animals that were nidopositive in your collection, and you could ensure that you weren't bringing in nidopositive animals into your collection, then things got so much easier. And I think it's one of the reasons why there's become a really overwhelming popularity with these things now, because people are finding out, and I'm trying to be one of the people to spread the word that these things are not what we thought they were, as far as being a species difficult to keep, difficult to maintain. So,
yeah, I have some animals in my collection that I want to test. I think I want to, I was talking to somebody about the cost of the tests, and testing now. I'm kind of behind the ball, right? Because I've already got this collection now going, and so now I'm thinking like, okay, anything that's had an RI, target that, and then maybe just pick out some other random animals that are in different parts of the collection, different areas of the house.
Absolutely, that's exactly
yeah.
Start.
Yeah, because I recently had an issue, and it's got me absolutely scratching my head. Now, talking to you, I'm curious about it because I have a jungle carpet that's in a tub, and eating great. Has had a couple sheds. I've had it for 4 months, or maybe 3 months. I can't remember, but he's been in quarantine the entire time. And recently went into shed. I gave him a meal, and it's been winter, so the air is definitely drier. He quarantine areas in a cooler area of the house, and I noticed he had like 2 scabs on his lower mandible, like right down here, and I sent some pictures to Ish, and he's like, yeah, it's, probably stomatitis, and he said like, it could just be a fluke, or, he's like, I don't want to use the S word, serpento.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I should start with that animal, because that's it. Like, I can't figure out why it happened. It was drier. It was cooler. I did mist, I missed in the tub, and how tubs are where they don't have the best airflow. So I'm kind of blaming myself for it. But at the same time, like, there's this part of me that's like, jungles are pretty hardy, they're hardy, and they're pretty vigorous, at least all of the other ones I have, so I'm a little bit concerned about that. So yeah, what do you use as far as testing? How does that look when you get a new animal? How do you test?
Yeah. I think just going back a little bit, I think in today's day and age, when you're buying or selling a Morelia species, nido testing is just an absolute. I mean, you don't buy one and you don't sell one unless, my preference is to have the seller test it before he ships it and the buyer test it when it gets there. I really think that should just like be going forward. That just needs to be, that's the standard in green tree pythons right now. Animals are not sold unless they're nido tested before.
Okay.
And it's super easy to do. I mean, you just open the mouth and you put a Q-tip type swab in there, and you just roll it around in the mouth. You don't need to get an intratracheal sample like you would if you were trying to rule out a bacterial infection. You just need to literally just swab the mouth for about 15 seconds. And you put the little applicator in the little tube that it comes in, and you put that in the mail and you overnight it. I use RAL, which is luckily local to me. They're about 45 minutes in the North Texas area.
Oh, nice.
But you can FedEx it overnight, and you usually get the results the same day. So
Okay.
super easy. I don't know. I think it costs about $20. I think you can get it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think it's about $20 through RAL, and I think you can get a discount if you just call them and say, "Hey, I want to send 20 samples." What kind of
Okay.
price point can you get? Because the way that test works is it doesn't really cost them anymore to run one versus 10. I mean,
Hmm.
if they need to run, they need to run the sample. Um, I think and I know that they give a discounted price on multiple samples.
Well, shoot, I'm going to hit them up as soon as we're done here.
Hey, I think it's worth to do exactly what you said. I would just spot test, and I would particularly spot test your Morelia species.
Yeah, and that would actually be a really easy thing to do. Would just be to hit all the Morelia and see what they come back with. Because it's like, sometimes, I mean, you know how it is. Like the uncertainty is so much worse
Yeah.
than the small amount of effort it takes. And I've been trying to. I've been in this situation where I'm trying to think of the best way to go about it. Do I want to spot test? But I mean, it might be easier just to grab all the Morelia. And I mean, doing my Timor pythons would be the absolute worst. So,
No, I think if none of your Morelia has been tested, I really do think you should test everything.
Okay.
And I'll just caution you, it's not the end of the world when an animal or two come back nido positive. We used to think it was. I mean, it used to be devastating, and people were putting all their animals in the freezer that were nido positive, even if they were asymptomatic. And, we have discovered that doesn't need to be the case. That an animal, at least in Morelia, can live with nidovirus its entire life, and you never know it has it. It's one of the problems with nidovirus because it can lay dormant or undetected for a long time, but that animal can act as a carrier to other animals. And even though that animal does perfectly fine with nidovirus, if it transmits it to another one for whatever reason, maybe different in immunity system or whatever, it crashes that animal, and sometimes very quickly. So you need to know which ones are nido positive. You need to separate those from the rest of the collection. But it will give you peace of mind, trust me, because animals will stop mysteriously dying. They'll stop mysteriously getting respiratory infections, even though you haven't changed your husbandry habits. You've got good husbandry habits. Why is this thing getting an RI? It'll just give you a lot of peace of mind.
Yeah, for sure. Because I blame myself. As soon as something goes wrong, I'm just beating myself up. Like what the hell did I do wrong here? I keep him in a meticulously clean tub, and he's in quarantine, and he's well fed, and I some of the tubs I have Govee hygrometers and thermometers in, so I'm able to keep an eye on things. So yeah, it's that's something. As soon as we're done here, I'm gonna that seems like a good way to go. Just send them a box full of tests.
Yeah, if you will email them, they'll
samples.
send you the little swabs that you need.
Okay.
10 swabs, 20 swabs, whatever you need. You'll get those in the mail, and then, like I said, just pick a time that's good for you, and send them overnight. The nidovirus is really the good thing is that it's a weak virus. It's an RNA virus outside the host. It doesn't last long, so you're not likely to transmit it touching a countertop that was exposed a month earlier, like some of these bacteria. The good part. The bad part is that it can break down quickly, and so if you take a sample and you let it sit around for a week and then you send it and they test it a week later, it's likely to test negative even though the animal's positive. So get those samples, get them overnighted, and they'll run them almost immediately when they get them, and then you'll be good to go.
So ideally, you'd collect all your samples at maybe like noon, 1 o'clock, something like that, and then get it to FedEx, and they'll have it in the morning.
Absolutely.
Okay. Huh. Yeah, and that's, I guess the more you do, the more cost effective it is, right? So you only have to pay the overnight shipping one time and, get as many done as possible.
Yeah, for sure. And the other thought about, I know you've had a lot of guests on your podcast. I don't know how much you want to continue to talk about Nidovirus, because we can talk about other stuff.
Until my heart rate goes over 115 and I have a panic attack.
I will tell you one other thing is that they recommend that just because you have one negative doesn't mean that you're just completely 100% in the clear. It means you probably are, but it's not 100%. Now, if you get a positive result, then there's no reason to ever test that animal again, because a positive is a positive. But a negative can be a false negative. And so depending on your collection, what you're bringing in, if the animal is symptomatic, you may consider testing again in like 6 months.
Okay.
And then if you have two negatives, people will tell you then that you're really out of the woods 95% of the time.
Okay. Now, do you, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, do you have any animals with Nido in your collection right now?
Not that I know of. I did. I did
Okay.
have Nido positive animals. And when I moved facilities, which was now about 7 years ago, that was right about the time that Nido testing was available. So I tested my animals, and I did have some Nido positive animals. And so when I moved into the new facility, luckily I have multiple rooms here. So all of what I call the old collection animals went in one area, and then everything that I acquired or produced new went into a separate area. And even animals that were Nido negative, when I tested them, I put them, old animals stayed in, the old room, whether they were Nido positive or Nido negative. And so I did have some Nido positive animals, and from what I know, those have all, passed on. But I'm still not going to mix, old room with new room, so to speak.
What did they actually pass from Nido, or did they pass from other causes?
I think they were probably all Nido related. I didn't get necropsies on them.
Okay.
Some of them died of respiratory infection. Others died of unknown causes, but I didn't get necropsies. But I would assume that being Nido positive at least had something to contribute.
Sure. Now, when they get an RI and they're Nido positive, is it a viral RI, or is it a bacterial RI that their body couldn't defend against? And does it respond to treatment of antibiotics?
Yeah, for sure. So it's a viral infection, but it can get a superimposed bacterial infection on top of it. And if that's the case and you treat with antibiotics, then there's a good chance that the animal, will recover. If it's a bacterial secondary source.
Okay.
That's why, back in the day before we knew about Nidovirus, we would take these animals to the vet. They do a culture, and sure enough, it would culture out a bad bacteria, and you'd treat that bacteria with antibiotics and the animal would get better. But a year later, it would happen again, because the animal was just, just predisposed to respiratory infections, probably because it was Nido positive.
Interesting. So it'd be like getting COVID and then getting pneumonia,
Exactly.
as a secondary infection.
Exactly.
Ugh, man, I'm so depressed right now.
I'm telling you, that is, trust me, I've been through this, and a lot of people go through this. That's your initial, it's kind of like the stages of grief, the different stages of grief, and then you go through acceptance, and then you go through recovery and all that. This should be good news to you. Even if you send stuff and you come back with some Nido positive animals, you have to remember in the long run, it's good news. You can think about it, and moving forward, you have a really good sense of security that you're not going to be bringing more Nido into your collection. And it's just as bad sending Nido out.
Yeah, I would never want to do that. That would be, that's absolutely, God, that would be horrible. So answer me this question then, because I feel like it would be like a total predicament. If I have an animal that tests positive, I am obsessive compulsive, and I am going to obsess over that animal being nidopositive, and I am going to view it as a risk to all the other animals in my collection, and I'm not going to want it anymore, right? So what do I do then? What do I do then as a keeper? What's the right thing to do in your mind?
Yeah, I can alleviate a lot of those concerns, and there's different options. If you have the ability to put that animal in a different room, then enough history have proven, because enough people have done it for long enough, that you are almost guaranteed that you are not, that animal, if it's in a different room, is not going to affect the rest of the animals. That's assuming you're not using feeding tongs on that animal and then going into that other room and using the same feeding tongs without cleaning them or whatever. I'm just saying, if you have proper husbandry and you isolate the animal into a separate room, then it all 99.9% guarantees that the other animals are not going to catch Nido. So some people don't have the ability to do that. They say, listen, I've got a very small room. I can't put them in a different room. And if that's the case, you have two options. You do the best you can, and you always treat your clean animals first, and all of your husbandry is completely different, from the feeding tongs to gloves you might wear, or everything has to be separate. And then you go to the animals that are positive and you do their husbandry last, and then you never go back to the clean animals, so to speak. So that's one option. And that actually has, people that I know that have done that have had good results doing that. It's luckily, Nidovirus is not an airborne virus. It's a contact virus. So, unless your animals are in direct contact with each other, or you're using husbandry tools and sharing them, there's a low likelihood that you're going to transmit Nidovirus from one to the other. Your other option is, Adam, is you just get rid of the animal. There are people that have nidopositive collections and are willing to take those animals. If you just deal with it, then you'll just have to kind of put some feelers out there, and, people are willing to take them. I know, at least in the green tree python community, there are people willing to take nidopositive animals. You're not gonna make a fortune selling that animal. It will probably just be a gift, or
Oh God, yeah, I'd give it away for free, as long as they're totally okay with taking a nidopositive animal.
Yeah.
The real concern of mine is that I've got a relatively small collection compared to yourself, most people I talk to. Less than 30 animals, and most of our animals are pets first. We're not. I'm trying to make $0 from my animals. I'm keeping them as I enjoy observing their behavior. I enjoy looking at them and watching them and interacting with them. My kids interacting with them, things like this. So that's my big fear, is that we're going to take an animal out of its enclosure. One of my kids will handle it, and then, come in contact with something potentially and spread it to another snake. So that's what scares me about having a nidopositive animal in the collection. And then I keep boas as well. And what if, the Morelia nido goes to a boa, what happens then? Is it lethal? Do they contract it?
That's another very, very interesting question, because they've discovered Nidovirus in so many species of reptiles now, but can one Nido species jump over to another, species? I think there's still some question of that, about if that can happen. But basically, the bottom line is, in your particular scenario, your kids should be washing their hands between every animal they touch. And if they do that, there's a good likelihood that they won't transmit Nido from one animal to the other.
Yeah, I have such a hard time just getting my kids to wash their hands when they come home from school.
I get it.
We're still working on training them to flush the toilet.
And then wash their hands.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's such a huge ask.
Well,
oh man,
that's all I can tell you. I would encourage you to test your animals. You don't have to blanket, shoot out 30 tests at one time, but I'd start the testing. You're gonna find out that it's really easy to do. First of all,
Yeah.
the process itself is easy, and it will give you peace of mind, and it will give you a plan. Now your plan is if your animal gets sick, the plan is you take it to the vet or it dies.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah. Speaking of boas, do you keep any kind of boas?
I have kept boas in the past, but I've never kept a large number. I've never bred boas. So the answer to the question is really no. I don't have any here. I've kept rainbow boas. I've kept Central American boas, but currently not.
Okay. And like a big concern. I remember back when I was in the hobby back in like 2011. I remember IBD was like such a huge concern, and I feel like it is less so now than it was then. Or I don't know if that's just like I remember coming back to the hobby. It doesn't feel like it's as frightening, and I feel like Nido's kind of it kind of gives me the same vibe as far as pythons go. How long, and it makes me wonder too, like how long has Nido been in captive collections? And then when did we really become aware of it?
Well, Nidovirus has always been here. Nidovirus has been in the wild and in collections since, thousands of years. Nidovirus has probably been around, but it's just been recently that we've been able to detect it. So, and I think that testing first became available probably about maybe 12 years ago. We started being able to test for Nidovirus in captivity, but it's always been there. It's in the wild now. You import a green tree python from Indonesia, you need to test it for Nidovirus because it's there.
So, what about heating for the green tree pythons that you have? What are your kind of parameters for their heating? I see these ones behind you here. Are they directly under radiant heat panels? And how do you regulate that temperature?
There's a lot of flexibility. A lot of people keep their green tree pythons ambient because they don't require like maybe as much heat as a ball python does. So I know people that keep them ambient with maybe an ambient temperature of 80 degrees during the day, and with a small night drop at night, and they do great that way. I keep them with a gradient. I have an ambient temperature during the day that's usually about 75, and then I'll keep a heated side with a radiant heat panel for adults. I usually keep that temperature about 84 degrees.
Okay. Yeah, it's not very warm at all.
No, it's not at all. And then I'll give them a night drop too. So all of my radiant heat panels go off at night. So they get no supplemental heat. So it's just 75 degrees, at night across the board. And then during the day, they have the zone of between really about 78 to 83 degrees, 84 degrees, depending on the cage.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I was using deep heat projectors for a little while, and so I'd have them on round the clock, and every time I would go in the snake room or even look at my my security cameras that I have in there, I'd never see them using the heat at night. And it kind of got to the point of like, why go out of my way to provide this heat source at night if they're it's not really natural for them to bask in darkness, Yeah,
I mean, almost all over the world, you get at least some decreased nighttime temperature, right? I mean, even on the the nights are a little cooler than the days, so makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, now as far as let's say somebody comes to you and they want to get a green python as a pet, and they want to go the bioactive route long term. What are your thoughts and feelings on that? Being somebody that keeps on paper and puppy pads, I'm assuming you do that because of the number of animals you have. It's easier to stay true to the husbandry, right?
Yeah.
But if somebody's going to have one or two animals, what are your thoughts with that?
Yeah, it's really pretty common, and I get this all the time. People want to get a green tree python, and they want to put it in a bioactive, with a waterfall and goldfish on the bottom and live plants, and just these things that you would think visually, would be very appealing, like to provide this super cool environment for the animal. I am not an expert at all in bioactive setups for any species, so I'm not going to really comment other than to say the vast majority of people that try to keep a green tree python in a bioactive environment fail. Um,
Okay.
and it's usually not the first month or the first 6 months, but it's usually a year, the year, 2 years after, um, one way or the other, it usually ends up failing. Now it can be done. I know it can be done. I've seen people that have done it successfully long term, but it would not be my choice, especially if it's your first green tree python, to offer them a bioactive environment.
And do you happen to like know of any of the failure points? Like what's going to be the cause of that failure?
Most of the time, it ends up being a respiratory infection or some kind of infectious process. The problem with bioactive, unless it's pristine, these animals, they're waste products. You can't always see. Like on a puppy pad, like when it takes a dump, it's taking a dump, right? And you just take it out of there and you clean it up and you put a fresh puppy pad in and you're good to go. But I think
Mm-hmm.
animals, are susceptible to infections in environments that aren't really, really clean. So, I think that's what gets most of them. Then there's others I've seen where these things are not the smartest reptile on the planet. In fact, I think they're probably the dumbest reptile on the planet, and they will find ways to kill themselves. And it doesn't mean if it's choking themselves out on a light cord that's gives them just enough room to get in there and try to use it as a perch. I've seen them. They're such terrible targeters when they strike at a prey. I've seen them miss the prey, hit substrate, bite substrate, and it just get engorged in their face. Um,
Mm.
just stuff like that. Just wait. I'm telling you, they'll just look for a way to kill themselves. And bioactive media give them plenty of ways to do it.
Wow. Have you ever had any try to eat a paper towel or a puppy pad?
Absolutely. They have struck and missed and hit that puppy pad. Now, most of the time, they will release that puppy pad after a few minutes. But I've had one or two where, I sat there and watched them, and sure enough, they tried to start to swallow it. Obviously that's when you intervene. So not all substrates are perfect. Even puppy pads have the potential, to be not a perfect substrate. But there have certainly been people that have had puppy pads ingested. I know of at least two cases that had happened, and a vet visit was required to extract the puppy pad.
Jeez. What about utilizing natural branches, like actual wood branches? Do you see an issue with that, or do you prefer just going the full PVC route?
I go PVC, but I know people utilize real branches, and they don't have a problem with
Okay.
using real branches.
Okay. So as long as there's not in your mind, as long as there's not a possibility of just ingesting, all these like substrate things like that.
Yeah. I think most people that use branches treat them some way. Maybe they they cook them, they bake them at a low temperature for a little while or something. I'm not exactly sure of what they do to prepare, but I know they can be used. They can be used successfully, yeah, without issue.
Okay. Now I know that like price point, a lot of the things you're working on, high end, designer, chondros. Do you offer anything that's on the lower end of the price point for a pet keeper, or is your clientele mostly looking for the high end designers?
Mostly for me, the high end designers. Occasionally, I'll have people that'll reach out that just have more money than they know what to do with, and they just say they just want a super cool designer pet green tree python. But most people that acquire my animals are looking to eventually reproduce them. They want to establish their own, you know, breeding colony and then reproduce the genetic traits that they're, whether it's high melanism or high blue or high yellow or calico, they acquire my animals. They're eventually looking to, reproduce them. And I tell people, price point's really important. But I tell people, whether you go to an expo and you spend $500 on an imported animal that's you're 50-50, at best to survive, or, you're looking to spend probably $1,000. $1,000 is what I tell people that they're looking to spend on an entry level green tree that's healthy, well established from a reputable source.
Okay, and that would be captive bred as well, right? Not
Absolutely.
wild caught and
Not farm bred, not wild caught. Now there are a few people that are have a good reputation for bringing in, say, farm bred animals or even wild caught animals and reestablishing them, them for parasites. Making sure that they're eating well, testing them for Nidovirus and all that. And then, I think you've got a really good chance of being successful if you go that route. But those animals typically aren't a whole lot less expensive than just a captive bred green tree.
Okay. Yeah, it seems like it would be so much effort to go through all that work of getting them established in the wild, between all the, I'm assuming that they would need to be dewormed or,
Yep.
and
Or
treated for parasites. Yep. And everything. It just sounds like a hassle.
Yeah. I agree. It would be my recommendation that you find, like I said, a reputable source that has a well-established captive bred animal. And when I say well-established, it's a lot different than a ball python where, maybe 3 or 4 meals and you're good to go. My threshold is 20 meals at minimum before I would send out a neonate, unless I was sending to somebody that had a lot of experience with green trees. So 20 meals minimum. They need to be sight feeding. They need to be just open the tub, put in the prey source, and just bang, just crushing it, which most of these things eventually go on to that, but it can take various times to get them, established and transitioned to sight feeding like that.
Is that part of what kind of drives up the cost as well of these animals? Not just the genetics, but the amount of time that's put into getting them going?
Yeah, it's the time, man. It's just green tree pythons are extremely easy to keep. They're not extremely easy to produce and establish. So that's why you don't see 68,000 of them listed on Morph Market. You see maybe 15 or 20 that are captive bred from a reputable source. And it's because of all that. It's just they're difficult to reproduce and establish. Compared to other species.
What are your thoughts on how they should be fed long term, whether that be for longevity or production? Where do you land on that? Because I've heard of people saying that they shouldn't really eat anything more than mice, and then I've heard other people say that that they should be on rats. What has your experience been with that?
I think all of those are viable food sources, depending on the size and the age of the animal and the feeding frequency. Most of my younger stuff are being fed mice, and that's primarily just a size issue. But certainly my adult animals, especially my females, they get a mix. They get a mix of mice, ASFs, and rats. Once subadult and adult females. I think the key is most people, especially if you're used to keeping other species, they tend to overfeed green tree pythons. So I think if you just are vigilant in your feeding, how often you're feeding and the size of the meals, then the source is much less important. Whether it's a mice, a rat, a quail, people are feeding green tree pythons quails, and I think it's more size dependent in the timing of the meals.
Okay, and so what's an ideal timing? for like let's kind of go through it, maybe break it up by the age of the animal. So maybe, 0 to 1 and then, 1 to 3. How do you change that timing, and what does it start out as?
Yeah, for neonates, fresh hatchlings, anywhere from 5 to 7 days, I think is an appropriate, um, feeding frame. Um, Once a week up until an animal turns 18 months old, a relatively small item once a week. Once an animal's 18 months old, then I will start breaking up that and, start going every 10 to 14 days. And then, when an animal becomes an adult, and I'm talking about for a male, once they hit 2 or 3 years old, then they're typically getting fed once every 2 weeks. Um,
Okay.
and then pretty much female the same. I usually offer female meals every 2 to 3 weeks. But it depends on what they're doing. If they just laid a clutch, and they're thin, well, then they'll get a small meal every week to get some size back on them. And then typically for adults that I'm breeding, I use food cycling as one of my techniques to get them to breed. So I will do a withholding of food or a forced fast, sometimes for 2 months at a time during certain parts of the year where they're not getting fed at all. So I think if you're just keeping the animal and you have a 2-year-old male, once every 2 weeks would be my answer.
Okay. So once every 2 weeks, and then that fast, is that during like the winter months where you'll cut them off for up to 8 weeks at a time? And is that both males and females?
Yeah, I've made this joke before. If you ask 10 green tree python breeders how they food cycle, you get 12 different answers. So, there's a lot of people are doing it a lot of different ways. I think just changing things up encourages them to breed. Withholding
Okay.
food and then offering food encourage the reproductive cycle in green trees. So I think there's lots of different ways to do it. I withhold food in the winter. And then I'll withhold, and because I pair in the winter. So I'll do a fasting for maybe 4 to 6 weeks before I introduce males, and then I'll introduce males, and then I'll continue that fast, usually for another month. And when I'm seeing multiple locks after, maybe I see 3, 4, 5, 6 locks, then I'll start reintroducing food to the female, maybe small meals more frequently, like maybe a small mouse or a mouse once a week as opposed to a small rat once every 3 weeks. Maybe that's their regular food cycle. So that's how I do it.
Okay. And when you're putting them back onto food, do you start out with a smaller food item and then work them up, or does it not matter in your mind? Do you just put them on whatever feels right at that point in time?
The males, it probably doesn't matter because I'm going to be feeding the males, once every 2 to 3 weeks, like I normally would. The females, I want to offer food more often, so I'll offer smaller meals more frequently when I'm trying to incentivize them to ovulate.
Okay. And what about temperature? Are you changing their temperature as well during that period?
Yeah, so I use food cycling, light cycling, and temperature cycling during my breeding season, which for me is in the winter, the fall and winter. So I'll decrease the light cycle from 12 hours on, 12 hours off, all the way, over the course of a month, maybe down to just 8 hours on during the day, and then, off the rest of the time. And then temperature wise, I don't change my day temperatures at all. So daytime temperatures don't change. At night, my temperatures are dropping about 5 degrees. So again, instead of being 75 at night, remember all the heat panels, all the heat goes off at night in my green tree setups. So at night, instead of the temperatures at 75, I'll work them down to about 70.
Okay. And the heat also changing with the light cycle? So that cool down period, is that now extending, and is the ability to heat up, is that changing from 12 hours down to 8 hours, or is it staying at 12 hours?
It's staying at 12 hours.
Okay.
Now, I will lower the room temperature. I won't just go from 75 at night to 70 at night overnight. So that process may take 2 weeks. I'll go 75 to 73, to 70 over a couple week period. But the daytime temperatures and that daytime availability to warm up, so to speak, I keep that at 12 hours.
Okay. And okay, so now kind of shifting over to enclosure size. What is your standard for an enclosure? And what's the bare minimum? Like, I like to start at the bare minimum, and then, so if you're getting somebody that says, hey, I want to get, whatever, 3.3 or 4.4, and I got, a ton of money that I just want to, blow on some animals as an investment.
Have them call me, Adam.
So what's the bare minimum you'd recommend for caging for adult animals, obviously?
Okay.
And then what's the ideal in your mind, and then how far can you take it?
The great thing about green tree pythons is because their size is really relatively small, these things, even as adults, can be kept in cages or tubs. My ideal cage situation for an adult male would be a 2x2x2 cube. And for a female would be a 3 foot wide by 2 feet deep, 2 feet high rectangle box. Those would be my ideal for a breeding female, 3 feet in length, for a male 2x2x2 cube.
Okay. And then how have you ever seen anybody like put them in a 4x2x4? Like, could that potentially cause problems in your mind, or do you think that that's fine with an adult, well-established animal?
I've got some 4 foot long cages that work great. I think you get into more trouble the higher you go.
Okay.
And that's because it's more difficult to regulate temperature and humidity in those circumstances. Temperature, especially. People tend to want to put green tree pythons in vertical cages, but they actually do better in horizontal cages because there's a very stable and consistent heat gradient in a cage that's horizontal. So that would be my preference. I think they can be kept in taller cages successfully. I don't have any experience really doing that. The tallest cage I've ever put a green tree python in has been 2 feet high.
Okay. So your concern would be that if your hotspot is 84 up at the top, it might be 75 or 70 down at the bottom, whatever the ambient room temperature is. So you might have to make that hotspot hotter.
Yeah, but then if you make it too hot, then the green tree pythons, they naturally go to height. One escapes in the room, you don't have to look far. You just have to look up because they will go there despite suboptimal conditions.
Okay.
You can make your hotspot too hot or too cold, and they're still going to climb up there.
Okay. Another question I had about temperature, and I forgot to ask, when do you start temperature cycling, and food cycling? When do you start all of your temperature light food cycling? Does that start at a year old, 2 years old, older?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't start any kind of temperature gradient, even a nighttime drop, until an animal turns about a year old. Most of all of those animals are really at that point they're being kept in tubs, whether it's a shoebox hatchling tub or move them up to a 15-quart tub. They're still exposed to constant heat at that age. Once an animal gets moved up, so you're talking past a year to 18 months, then I'll start offering that nighttime temperature drop.
Okay. And the full blown cycle with food and everything, does that start about the same age at that 18-month mark?
I really don't food cycle animals unless I'm going to breed them.
Okay.
Maybe the year before I decide I'm going to pair them, I'll start to introduce some fasting, some forced fasting. But other than that, I feed them on a pretty routine schedule. I'm still trying to get size on these animals. I want to, I want to keep them growing. I don't want to overfeed them, but I want them to continue to grow. So I'm not offering any kind of fasting with them.
Okay. And what about your like your short tails? Are they going through a similar change with the cycling?
They're subject to the light cycling, obviously, because I've got my room lights on a timer. The heat and the food, not so much. I've never really found that they needed that. And to be honest, I haven't bred short-tailed pythons in the last 3 years. I
Okay.
haven't bred anything, any species other than green tree pythons in the last couple of years.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask how many chondros you have?
Oh gosh, I probably have maybe 30 mature adults. And
Okay, that's not as many as I thought, honestly.
yeah, I think I've got like maybe close to 20 adult breeding females and then like 10 males. It would be close to that.
Okay.
Like this year, I paired 12 females, and depending on what happens, that's plenty. It looks like right now I'm going to have at least 7 clutches, and that'll be
Wow.
the most that I've ever had. I've had 6 clutches 1 year before, but 7 clutches of green tree pythons, even if you're doing this full time like I am, will keep you busy. It'll keep me busy every single day, most of the day. If I ended up with 70, 80, 90 baby green trees.
Yeah, that's so many babies. And how many of those are going to take right to rodents right out of the egg after shed?
I would say most of them. I would say probably I'm successful getting a green tree baby to eat 60% of the time, the first time I try it. And usually by the third time I try, probably 80%. But it's taking me time. It's not like I just put it in there and it eats. I may have to tease feed each one for 20 minutes before I get it to eat for the first time.
Oh my God.
But it's an 80-20 rule. 20% of the animals cause you 80% of the problems. And it's those 20% that aren't eating after your third attempt, no matter how much time you spent with them. Those are the ones that, 3 months after they hatch, they're taking up the vast majority of my time.
Yeah. So how long after they hatch, how long is it generally before you offer their first meal?
So I wait for their first shed. They'll typically have their first shed within maybe 8 to 10 days. And then I'm usually offering them food after that.
Okay. And if they take the rodent, fantastic. If they don't, what's your game plan? Do you have scenting techniques? Do you just primarily focus on tease feeding? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I scent everything for their first meal. I don't even attempt a pink without chick down scenting. So they
Okay.
all get presented, and if they eat the first time with chick down scented pink, great. Then I'll work towards weaning them off after that. The animals that don't eat, tease feeding is your number one technique to try to get a baby green tree to eat. You get it angry, and then it strikes, wraps, and eats. I'll try different things. A few years ago, I started messing around with chicken gizzards, strips of chicken gizzards cut to the approximate size of a day old pink. Scenting that, sometimes they'll take that, but all said and done, usually after 3 attempts, if I'm getting nowhere at all, and they won't, some of them don't even strike. They're called runners. They'll just run. After about
Yeah.
3 attempts, 3 weeks, then I'll start assist feeding them. And I have found that strip of chicken gizzard is by far the best source to assist feed them. It's super easy. I used to try to use pinks, but a day old pink would turn into mush before you could get it halfway down its throat, and it has almost zero nutritional value. And then I started using rodent tails, because rodent tails were great. You could slip it halfway in its mouth, super easy, and then it would learn to swallow. I think in these things, teaching it to swallow is a big part of getting them established. So you could stick that tail halfway in, halfway out, and then it would swallow. The problem with that is, again, almost no nutritional value. But the chicken gizzard you can cut into the size strip that you want, put it in a little bit of hot water. It'll firm up a little bit, give it that nice firm consistency. And you can just slide it halfway down the back of their throat, put them in the tub, and they'll swallow the rest of it, and gives them, a lot better nutrition than a pink.
Mm. And how does scenting with chick down? How do you do that? Are you because I've heard some people actually like scrub the pinky with Dawn or some other soap and then rinse it. And are these frozen thawed and you're just taking them damp and dipping them in chick down, or is the chick down wet?
That's exactly what I do. So everything, I never offer a live meal. Everything is frozen thawed, and I'll thaw it out and I'll put it in hot water, get it to a good hot temperature. And then I'll just dip that into dry chick down and try to get the face, fairly well covered in chick down, and then
Okay.
the animal that way.
And do you ever have to like brain the pinkies or anything?
I've never done it. I just haven't found it that it's been that successful for me. For me, the chick scent is really, magical. Um, in terms of getting them to eat for the first time, I've tried many, many other forms of scenting. Everything from who is it that makes is it the Reptilinks that makes the
Yeah.
scenting? I've tried all those. I've tried tuna fish. I've tried braining. But consistently, time and time again, the chick down is what has worked best for me. And so I'm basically the point now, especially if I'm working with a bunch of neos, it's chick down. And if the chick down doesn't work, then I'm going to stick a piece of gizzard down your throat until you decide to eat. That's the best I got for you,
Yeah. It's so do you ever have animals where you have to give up, or is it once you have to go to assist feeding, what's the success rate there? Is there ever ones that just will not switch over to taking a meal on their own?
Yeah, the vast majority eventually do. That could be
Okay.
months into the working, and it can be a very slow progress where maybe one time it decides to strike, and you're lucky enough to get, a tiny piece of chicken gizzard stuck in their mouth, or even a pink head stuck in their mouth, and then it swallows. That can take months for that to happen. But the vast majority, I would say 90% of the ones that I assist feed and don't die of some other crazy cause like prolapse, they will come around and they will eventually eat.
Mm. Prolapse. That's when is that an issue? What do you think causes it? How have you dealt with it in the past?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's certainly, if you produce a large number of green tree pythons, you're going to eventually deal with prolapse. The cause of that is really unknown. The obvious thing is hydration and humidity. But once you rule those two things out, and we've talked about how you can rule out a hydration issue or a humidity issue. So once you rule that out, then you have to start thinking about things like, well, you're feeding them day old mice pinks. They're essentially a bag of water. So they're all, very poor nutritional value there. There's other theories of why neonates prolapse. Everything from low calcium levels in the mother causes low calcium levels in the neonate, which causes their teeth to shed, and then that shed teeth get caught when they're trying
Oh
to
my God.
digest and dump, and that causes them to prolapse. So there's a bunch of different theories about why they prolapse. Basically, we don't know why if you rule out the obvious things. That's why I started incorporating chicken gizzards into their diet, and I have definitely noticed a decreased incidence of prolapse. Some of that can just be, related to so many other things. I haven't done it enough, and certainly haven't done a study to study it, the incidence, because the incidence of prolapse in neonates really isn't that high. But when you deal with it a few times, then you want to try to do some things to try to prevent it if you can.
Okay.
So that's one of the things, we don't really know what causes it. It's probably a food source issue. But once it happens, there's a couple different things you can do. A lot of times, especially if it's a small prolapse, the sugar paste, which you may have heard about that technique using on prolapses in other species, you coat the prolapse in sugar paste, and it will reabsorb and work out on its own. If that doesn't work or the prolapse is really big, then you have to manually reduce the prolapse. And I use like a very small sexing probe with preparation H ointment to do that and reduce that. And most of the time, if a neonate prolapses once and you're able to get it reduced and you treat it accordingly after that, it won't prolapse again. But if a neonate prolapses twice, I've had very poor success. That's probably an anatomical issue. If that is happening like that, and then you really can't fix that, and so those animals, in my experience, have not gone on to do well.
Is there a like a surgical solution to something like that, or is it just it's just natural selection and that animal isn't meant to survive?
Yeah, again, it's hard to tell because we're feeding them different things in captivity that they're eating in the wild. I don't know if baby green trees prolapse in the wild because they're eating different things. They're eating bugs. They're eating small geckos. They're not eating mice pinks. So I don't know. I'm fairly certain there can be an anatomic propensity. I had one clutch a couple of years ago where half the clutch prolapsed, and
Jeez.
I think that was potentially a genetic issue. So I never repeated the pairing between those two parents again because I thought it might have been a genetic anatomic problem, with those babies. And all babies, they had multiple prolapses and not a single one survived.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That must have been devastating.
Oh, it was terrible because they were incredible looking animals from incredible parents.
Wow. So they could just possibly be like a toxic combination?
I think potentially. I mean, again, I don't know. I've bred both those parents since that, and I have not had a prolapse issue. Bred them to different animals.
Interesting. And so are there any other issues that you've run into as far as like perhaps inherited or just some sort of a genetic abnormality?
Not really. Those are the two, animals that are difficult to get established, and animals that prolapse are by far number one, and number two that you're going to deal with is somebody trying to establish a clutch of green tree pythons.
Yeah. Do you ever run into kinks or anything like that?
Yeah, I've noticed kinks. Usually you don't pick that up until the animal's older. And that's kinking again is one of the reasons we don't sex baby neonate green tree pythons, because sexing them either via probe or popping can cause their tail is so fragile that it can cause kinking, and you won't see the kink initially. But as the animal grows and that tail gets more substance to it, then you'll notice, oh, wow, I got a big kink in the tail.
Oh, geez.
Most of the kinking that happens, I mean, I've seen animals that have been kinked out of the egg, but most of the kinking that happens usually, you don't know exactly when it happens, but you notice it when they're a little older.
Can you run into any of that when you're doing like assist feeding, just with that handling, or is it just the tail that's really fragile?
I think anytime you have to take one of these things off the perch, it introduces an element of risk for kinking. That's why, again, we don't recommend that you really handle these things as neonates. But when assist feeding, you do what you have to do. And the vast majority of the times, either animals that I've kept or animals that I've sold that have been assist fed have not had kinking issues. Now, people, not in my experience because I've never done it, but people that have sexed babies, they've got a lot higher degree of kinking as the animal gets older. But simply feeding, I really haven't noticed that to be an issue.
But and so this doesn't have anything to do with genetics, though. This is just yeah.
Correct. Okay. Yeah, it's all mechanical. I think the kinking that we see in all species right out of the egg, you don't know if that's genetic or environmental or what. But yeah, they can be kinked out of the egg as well.
I was just talking with Shira Loa last week, and she was saying that she has a snake that has kinks down its spine from a bacterial infection. And it's like a common bacteria that most snakes have in them, but I guess it just kind of took over, and it caused this kinking down the animal's spine.
Interesting.
Yeah, which is kind of concerning. It's scary that can happen.
I wonder how they diagnosed that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. They might have done a bunch of cultures. I wish I could remember which bacteria it was. But it was something that's like pretty common, but it just was in a very, it had just kind of taken over, and it kind of got the upper hand in the animal system.
That's how, most infections, whether you're in reptiles or people, are like that. They're called opportunistic infections. And, the bacteria will be present in your body, your mouth, your digestive flora. But if you get immunocompromised or, whatever the case may be, then those bacteria that are normally there take over and become more than your immune system can handle.
Yeah, it's frightening. It makes you wonder, keeping these animals in captivity, if we're just kind of giving that opportunity, in certain situations, where you can have the smallest parameter that's off.
For sure.
And then, it's kind of like this jungle that got the scabs on his lower lip. I was racking my brain trying to remember if he grabbed the tongs and caused trauma to the inside of his mouth, like what could have
certainly could.
Or if he just struck it, the side of the tub, and that's the problem with keeping in tubs too, is I can't tell I don't know if he's pushing, if he's trying to get out.
It's amazing more of these animals don't get sick and die, that we have that they don't. I mean, it's amazing, because you're right. We're keeping them in a box, and the parameters, it just, to me, sometimes I'm like, man, it's crazy that these things stay as healthy as they do and live as long as they do.
Yeah. I mean, I just moved my, my two, younger Argentine boas into enclosures, 3x2 by 1.5 foot enclosures. And, watching them now, I'm like, man, this is what you guys do all day, cause they were in tubs that I couldn't see them. And I gave them cocoa substrate that's maybe 3 inches deep. And the one is completely burying itself with just the very tip of its nose sticking out of the substrate, to the point, I mean, you'd have no idea, but you see this, the cocoa block, the chip in there, and you see just this one gray snout, just like a 1/4 inch sticking out, everything else is totally submerged. And it's like, man, I didn't expect to see that.
Absolutely. I don't know. That's kind of the inquisitive part. That's what makes this fun, observing your animals, and what they're doing, even though we're providing such a small ecosystem for them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's wild. So what about localities and line? Well, I guess it would just be localities, right? With chondros. Are you into the localities at all, or are you strictly into designer animals?
I do strictly designer and some designer outcrosses. I do have a couple of locality animals here, but I'm typically breeding designer animals to them. I love locality animals. There's a lot of people that focus on localities. It's kind of like the carpet python community. A lot of people, are very strict into the species and subspecies, and then there's other people that are willing to, make intergrades or even hybrids. And really, what all designer animals is they're, depending on the taxonomy now, if you want to call them intergrades or if you want to call them hybrids, you're typically you're breeding these things for a specific phenotype. And in green tree pythons, the designer stuff is typically either high yellow, high blue, high black, or calico, which could be lots of different things. But typically those are kind of the designer traits that we're looking for. And ultimately all of those traits somewhere down the line came from a locality animal. These things have been bred in captivity since the 1970s.
Hmm.
Some of the lineage and history will show that. I've got animals in my collection where, initially brought into the United States by some of the founding fathers of, green tree pythons. So, to answer your question, I do primarily designer stuff, but there's a lot of locality work out there.
Okay, so you'll have maybe a designer that you will breed to a locality trying to achieve a specific look.
Yeah, like last year I had a designer animal that I bred to a manicory locality type, and the babies that turned out, really, a lot of them came on the visually they looked like a manicory but on steroids. Like
Mm.
blues were brighter, the green was brighter, just kind of like almost an enhanced trait. Others will come out and look completely different. Again, it's kind of the Frankenstein. You don't know what you're going to get. It's part of the allure to breeding green tree pythons. You breed ball pythons, you know what you're going to get, or you have the odds of getting this versus that. You breed two pieds together, they're all going to be pieds. But when you're breeding designer green tree pythons, you don't know what you're going to get. And even better, you have to wait to see it because it takes sometimes 2 to 3 years before their ontogenic color change happens and you get the final adult coloration and pattern. So super exciting. That kind of stuff is really, to me at least, it's really exciting.
So how do you start planning that out and like when well, I have two questions here, and I guess the second question would be the easier to answer. When do you look at an animal and decide when it's going to breed? Are you going off of weight or age or both?
Yeah, primarily it's age. So males can really breed quite young. I had a 2-year-old that bred this year. That's not the
Wow.
norm. Most of them are 3, 4, and even 5 years old. But I'll always give a 2 or 3 year old male an opportunity to breed if it's something that I want to produce. Females, I definitely go more on age, and the youngest female I've ever bred has been 4. Most of them are 5 when they breed. 4-year-old has to be perfect. It has to have both the age and the size. But I think age is more important than weight. I could get a female green tree up to a certain size within 2 or 3 years, but it doesn't mean that she's going to go on and successfully produce viable eggs.
Mm.
You think you just be patient, let that animal get to be 4 or 5, and you're going to have better success.
Okay, and does longevity play into that as well? Like if you take your time, are you going to get a more sustainable source of offspring from that animal?
I think so, but I don't think there's any doubt that breeding, particularly female green tree pythons, takes a toll on them and it decreases their lifespan, even under the best of circumstances. Even if you wait, even if you give them a year off between clutches, it's been in my experience they tend to live less than even breeding males.
Okay,
I think if you had a
and
female and you never bred her, then she could live to be in her early 20s or mid 20s, but you rarely see a breeding female, make it past 15 years old.
really, wow. And so, I mean, how many clutches would you expect to get out of a female?
That's a good question. It depends. I can't answer that because I still have, some females. The female that's over this shoulder, she has produced probably, I've had her since she was a baby. She's probably produced 7 clutches for me over the years, and she's still going strong. So,
Hmm.
I think, at least in my experience, I couldn't even really give you a good number of what they're capable of. I know some people that have bred females just literally back to back to back for 5, 6 years, and the animal just keeps going. But I think most people would tell you that what I tend to do is do 2 years. If I breed them back to back, then I give them that third year off. But they have to recover really well after that first year to breed them back to back years. But most of them do. Most of them immediately go back on food and then, by the breeding season have regained their normal weight and body structure, and then they're good to go again.
All right. Well, Bill, I appreciate it. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing all your information. I got one last question for you. If somebody came to you and said you can't have chondros anymore, what would you do?
I don't know. It would be terrible. It would be absolutely terrible, because these are really what my day to day life looks like now. That would be like, me telling, well, you can't go to work anymore. You can't go in there and do what you look forward every morning, getting up and going and doing. So that would be really, really tough. I guess I would try to focus on my other species, but it wouldn't be the same.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I like I said, I appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much, Bill. I know you got to get going, and I appreciate all your information. And maybe one day I'll have a chondro. Who knows?
Well, I hope so. That would be one of my goals, is to get one in your hands and see you do well with it, and let you catch chondro fever. But
oh gosh, yeah, I could imagine going into a downward spiral with them.
I can't tell you how many times I put a green tree python in somebody's hands for the first time, and they go, it's like nothing they've ever experienced before. So that's the other thing. I'll take 1 second here before we wrap it up is,
sure.
One of the things that kept me from keeping green tree pythons was their disposition. And not that I want to hold a green tree python all day, every day, but I always wanted to be able to just, whether I'm cleaning the cage or if I just want to get the animal out and really appreciate the way that it looks, maybe, even outside. I always wanted to be able to do that. And I thought that wasn't the case with green trees. And I would just like you and the audience to know that every single green tree python I have in my hands, there's not a single one that I can't get out and get off the perch and handle like it was a ball python.
Really?
Yeah. I'm talking upwards of 40 or 50 animals. There's not a single one that I can't get out and handle.
And what age does that happen at, where you can handle them without potentially causing any issues?
I'd say like at a year of age.
Okay.
And they're pretty much out of that danger zone for getting tail kink. Obviously if you're careful with them.
Okay.
And even the babies,
right on.
Even the babies have good temperaments. The ones that I have to assist feed, they just come right off the perch. Just rarely. I've been bitten one time by an adult green tree python, and that was my mistake, showing it off at night. When they get very food aggressive at night. They're hunting but that's the only time I've ever been bitten by an adult green tree.
Right on. All right. Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. And people can get in touch with me, or if they want to follow me on Instagram, I'm Phoenix Reptiles on Instagram, or Bill Stegall on Facebook.
I've got everything in the show notes. I've got your website, your Instagram, your Facebook, and your Morph Market account all listed there. So if anybody wants to check you out, all four are listed there. I noticed your website takes you right to Morph Market. That's a pretty cool little trick there.
Yeah. Well, I'll say my website is in bad need of updating, especially the Green Tree Python. Well, really all of it. There's no availability there. But there is some stuff there. There's some links to my social media, and there are some like chondro clutches there that I produced in the past. I'm just like 4 years behind on updating it.
Right on. Well, I would imagine anybody that is listening to this, they probably already know who you are and they know where to find you. But if they don't, it's all in the description. So
well, thanks again, Adam. I look forward to meeting you in person, maybe at one of the upcoming expos.
Oh, heck yeah. Yeah. Hopefully. Do you go to Daytona?
I went to Daytona for the first time last year, but it's probably not going to be on the menu this year. I'll be at Tinley in October. And of course, the Dallas, which is only 45 minutes from me, has NARBC here twice a year. And every September I throw a party on Friday nights, and that anybody's welcome to come to that party. I just need to know that they're coming because I provide dinner. So, and it's a big event. Usually, over 100 people come every year. So
Wow.
love to see you down for that. It's the Friday night, right before the Dallas September NARBC.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, I'd love to
A lot
come
of fun.
sometime.
It is a lot of fun.
That's awesome. All right. Thank you, sir.
All right. Take care.
You too.